Welcome to this Studium Generale lecture. Studium Generale has asked me to talk about human rights in the corona crisis, and it's a pleasure to do so. Now, my name is Brigit Toebes. I work at the Faculty of Law of the University of Groningen. I am founding member of a research center called Global Health Law Groningen, and I'm coordinator in the Aletta Jacobs School of Public Health. I hold the chair Health Law in a Global Context, and in that setting, I look at the protection of health, global, domestic health, through the lens of law and human rights. Now, the corona crisis is a crisis of public health, but you can also say it's a crisis of human rights, because it unavoidably leads to situations where human rights are compromised. And the question then is, to what extent may human rights be compromised in this setting? And how do you do that? How do you balance human rights in this crisis? Now, I must say I find all the information in the news about the corona crisis rather overwhelming. There's so many dimensions to it, and I'm the first to admit that human rights are just one lens through which we can look at this crisis. And at the start of this lecture, I would also like to say that it's one thing to talk specifically about how human rights come into play in this crisis, but I would like to grasp the opportunity to talk a bit more generally about human rights, talk about their origins, their nature and their scope, where do we find human rights, so as to set the stage for the more specific analysis of human rights in the corona crisis. If you have questions after this lecture, feel free to insert them in the comments box, and I will try to respond afterwards. So that brings me now to the more general introduction to human rights in this particular lecture. Often the Second World War is mentioned as the most important time at which human rights as we know them today emerged, and that's indeed the case. But in addition to that, there's many references in history to human rights. So we can see human rights rather as an evolutionary phenomenon that has matured over time. And again, there's these many references throughout history to human rights. Take the Greek tragedy, Antigone. It's very interesting how Antigone invokes the laws of the gods to justify the burial of her brother, and as such to set aside the laws of the king, Creon. So that tension between a national law or measure and a higher law, that's precisely also how we perceive human rights. That brings me to the three so-called generations of rights. The term generations of rights is a little bit outdated these days. Rather, we talk about types of human rights or categories. But the interesting thing about generations is that it shows that different types of rights can be traced back to different points in history. For example, civil and political rights, as we know them today, clearly have their origins in the Age of Enlightenment, around 1800. And that was a time when important scholars, including Locke, talked about the ideas of a social contract, the idea that those in power have to do something in exchange for that power. And there was also around that time talk about the idea of natural rights, rights that we have because we are human beings, and we derive these rights from God, from nature, for example. Now, again, this was a time that was important for the development of civil and political rights, including rights to life, liberty, freedom of religion, fair trial, and so on. And the second point in history is the era of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. And this was a very important time for the evolution of so-called economic and social rights. It was a time, of course, of tremendous economic growth, but it was also a time of poverty, of poor working and living conditions, of child labor, of infectious disease outbreaks, including cholera. And that triggered the development and the recognition of social rights movements. So it was an important time for the development of social rights. Thirdly, we have the so-called collective rights. So not individual human rights, but collective rights, rights that we own as a collectivity. And they can be traced back to the era of decolonization in the 1950s. This was the time where the colonized peoples claimed their right to self-determination, the right to become independent from their colonizer. And collective rights include this right to self-determination, but it can also be the right to development, for example, or the right to an environment. These rights are somewhat controversial, but I would like to stress their importance. In a time of climate change and environmental degradation, you can see how important these rights are and how important it will be to claim, for example, a collective right to an environment. I would like to jump back a little bit in time to the Second World War. As I mentioned, this was a really important time for the development of human rights. There was this strong realization that the atrocities committed during that period should not happen again, and that mechanisms should be adopted to protect us, societies, individuals, from such horrendous forms of state abuse. And on this slide, you see Eleanor Roosevelt. She's the wife of the former president of the US during the Second World War. His name is Franklin Roosevelt, and she was involved in the adoption of the first international human rights instrument adopted after the Second World War. And it is the so-called Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted in 1948. It's a very comprehensive instrument. It contains both civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. And it marked, importantly, the beginning of a phase of standard setting. So that's really important for the development of human rights. So which standards were then adopted after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? On this slide, I show you the 9 core human rights treaties of the United Nations. So these are treaties to which many states around the world have become parties, and as a result of that, they are legally bound to realize the rights in these treaties. On the top of the list, you see the two most recognized human rights treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Both were adopted in 1966. It was the time of the Cold War, so no agreement could be reached on which rights were more important. Former USSR emphasized the importance of economic, social, and cultural rights. US, in particular, emphasized the importance of civil and political rights. Hence, not one integrated instrument, but 2 separate instruments were adopted. It's perhaps of interest to mention that China has not become a formal party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and as such does not endorse rights in this treaty, including freedom of movement, privacy, whereas the US, on the other hand, is not a formal party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and as a result of that, doesn't recognize the right to health in that instrument, of importance in the current corona crisis. On this list, you also see a number of more thematically oriented treaties. There's one focusing on racial discrimination, there's one focusing on torture, you see also one that focuses on enforced disappearances. And you see some treaties that focus on a specific group in society: women, children, migrant workers, persons with disabilities. And this shows how human rights law is focused on the protection of vulnerable groups in society. That is really a key feature of human rights, protecting the vulnerable. That's really important. Now, what's also important to mention is that what we see on this list is a treaty on persons with disabilities. What we do not see in this list is a treaty on older persons. And what we see in the corona crisis is that older persons are particularly vulnerable. So it's perhaps important or interesting to mention that there is debate about whether a treaty for older persons should be adopted, but it's also controversial and it is a very long and difficult process. But a treaty protecting older persons is potentially in the making in the future. I should also mention that we do not only have human rights treaties at the international UN level, but we also have them at the regional level. We have them in Europe within the framework of the Council of Europe. We have them in the Americas, and we have them in Africa. Unfortunately, in Asia, there's no human rights treaties yet. In addition to treaties, there's also monitoring mechanisms. This means mechanisms to monitor the implementation of treaties by the countries. And this can vary from courts to complaint mechanisms to state reporting procedures to, for example, a special rapporteur. So there is a possibility for you as an individual, if your rights have been violated, to go to your national court with your human rights violation. But after that, potentially you can also go to an international body. You can submit a complaint to an international treaty monitoring body, for example. Or you can also go to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. So those are the human rights treaties. Let me now mention some key features of human rights. I would like to mention 4. What we can say is that human rights are internationally agreed values. And it can be summarized as follows. We can say that human rights are all ultimately aimed at protecting our human dignity as human beings. And this human dignity is a broad concept that translates into a number of more specific values and rights. The protection of our privacy, our physical integrity, our freedom of expression, but also the protection of our health. And these are some rights. So these values translate into specific rights. And I'm mentioning a few on the slide that are of particular importance in the corona crisis. The right to privacy, the right to physical integrity, freedom of expression, right to health, right to education are particularly important in the corona crisis. I'll come back to that later. We have rights and states have legal obligations to guarantee our rights. They have negative obligations to respect our freedom of expression, for example, but they have also positive obligations, doing something, guaranteeing our access to healthcare services, for example. And a key feature underlying this whole body of human rights law is the principle of non-discrimination. Non-discrimination runs as a thread through the whole body of human rights law. It's again about protecting vulnerable groups in society and making sure, for example, that everyone is entitled to equal access to healthcare services. That brings me to my analysis of the corona crisis and how human rights come into play there. And ask the question, how can the body of human rights law that I've just set out be applied in this specific crisis? Now, in this crisis, I would like to illustrate it as follows. What it boils down to is what we are balancing, in essence, is on the one hand, protection of public health, and on the other hand, the protection of a range of individual freedoms. And let me first talk a little bit about measures that need to be taken to protect health. To start with, there has to be a properly functioning healthcare system to ensure that corona patients and other vulnerable persons have access to care. But so there has to be access to sufficient hospital beds, healthcare personnel. Ultimately, there has to be a vaccine. But at the same time, this healthcare system should also be able to cope with regular care outside corona treatment. The healthcare system should not collapse under such a crisis. These things all need to be in place. And in addition to that, in order to ensure public health, protecting public health also means imposing social distances, for example, travel bans, and potentially also a lockdown, a serious lockdown, or a more limited lockdown. That is measures to take to protect the health of the public. But on the other hand, we want to respect individual freedoms. So there's a freedom to move around, to go to the shops, to go to work, to go to school, freedom to travel, and also freedom to conduct a business. And it requires a constant balancing on the part of governments. We see different governments taking different approaches, varying from gradual steps to a complete lockdown. It's interesting and important to look at the different types of measures that governments take. So let's take a closer look at these various measures with our new knowledge about human rights in the background. What we see in the corona crisis is that both these economic, social, and cultural rights and these civil and political rights come into play. And at the center of the whole human rights analysis is this right to health. So measures need to be taken to guarantee the right to health, to guarantee the health of society, access to healthcare, and so on. But taking measures to secure the right to health potentially compromises other human rights. It potentially compromises, for example, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to education. Because if children are barred from going to school, their access to education is potentially under threat. And potentially the right to health is also a tension with these civil and political rights. Right to privacy, right to physical integrity, freedom of movement, and freedom of expression. So this requires a very careful balancing on the part of states. And it is this balancing of human rights, you can say it's ill understood, it's difficult, and we know too little about it. What we do know is that in the human rights doctrine and case law, there is two ways in which human rights can be suspended. And I should say in particular, the civil and political rights. So there's two tools also in the treaties that underline how human rights may be suspended. There's suspension light in the form of limitations. That means that you are going to limit specific rights. So you are going to limit, for example, freedom of movement. You're going to say you're no longer allowed to travel, for example. It's important that such limitations of these individual rights are prescribed by law. So there has to be a basis in the law before you can introduce such a limitation. In the Netherlands, clearly this is prescribed by the Wet Publieke Gezondheid, for example, that gives very clear direction as to how measures can be taken. There also has to be a legitimate aim. Under human rights law, there has to be a legitimate aim for limiting human rights. And one of the legitimate aims, and this helps, is public health. So human rights can be limited for the sake of public health. It's also important that the limitations to rights are informed by medical science, that those who take the decisions inform themselves about the health facts. What is often mentioned in this context is the principle of proportionality. You can say that the principle of proportionality brings all these requirements together. And it asks the question, which measures are proportionate in light of the public health goal? We could say that the severity of the measure taken should fit the seriousness of the health problem. Now, you currently see governments making these assessments on a daily basis. It's very difficult, and the outbreak seems a moving target with the situation changing constantly. Then there's also the more drastic way of suspending rights, and that is through derogations. This is where states declare an emergency, and as a result of that, they may derogate temporarily from human rights. This leads to many rights being suspended completely. Some rights, this is clearly declared in the treaties, may never be suspended. The right to life, the prohibition of torture, the prohibition of slavery, those rights have always should remain intact. But bear in mind, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, right to privacy can be set aside completely. These measures, a derogation should not be introduced lightly. Setting aside freedom of movement, privacy completely is, in my view, a very drastic step. And I must say that I'm worried about this trend of a number of European countries also declaring a state of emergency, and as a result of that, having the ability to derogate from human rights. For example, it means that freedom of expression can be limited, a right that is so crucial in any crisis, because people, and in particular healthcare providers, should be able to voice their needs. Journalists should be able to express their concerns and to write about what's going on. It is too soon to tell whether human rights have been violated in current crisis, but it is important to remain alert and to monitor very carefully what is going on, I would say. Now, you've heard me talk about human rights and obligations of states in this context. You may ask, what is the responsibility of society at large? What are the human rights responsibilities of society? Do we as individuals also have responsibilities? There is an interesting basis for that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that document that I mentioned earlier that was adopted in 1948. And it says that every individual and every organ of society shall promote respect for these rights. And I would say that in the corona crisis, this is in essence a call for solidarity, to be cautious and to protect ourselves for the sake of protecting others, in particular the vulnerable in society. In addition to that, we must also talk about another actor that plays such an important role in addressing the current crisis, and that is the pharmaceutical industry. Now, again, like us as individuals, corporations, including the pharmaceutical industry, do not have legal human rights obligations under human rights law. But it is increasingly recognized that corporations have responsibilities to respect human rights. That's not as far-reaching as what states have, like legal obligations to actively protect human rights. No, it's a responsibility to respect human rights. It's something more modest. So what does it mean, right? That's an important question. In my interpretation, it means being transparent about how you conduct your business, how the price of a product is composed, the price of a certain medicine, a vaccine. And in this crisis, not withholding information about drugs, about vaccines for the sake of your own profit. I would say that that dramatically compromises human rights. I've come to the end of this lecture. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for listening. I think the overarching message is that human rights do certainly not provide all the answers, but they emphasize who is vulnerable in this crisis and who needs protection. And governments and potentially other actors have legal obligations to protect the vulnerable in our society. Should you have any questions about this lecture, please, again, feel free to insert them in the comments section. I thank you for your attention, and I thank Studium Generale for this opportunity. And I would like to conclude by saying, stay healthy, look after yourself and everyone around you. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.